Welcome back to the Patient First Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Bryan Laskin, where, of course, we're looking to increase the influence of today's engaged dentists. And today, I have with me a great member of the dental industry, Bill Neumann, who is CEO of Group Dentistry Now with over 17 years of experience in the dental industry. Bill, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks, Bryan. It's a pleasure.
Well, we were talking a little bit before. You have had you've moved around a bit in the dental industry. So kind of talk about your path through the dental industry and how you got to be CEO of Group Dentistry Now.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those interesting paths that I had a finance background when I got out of college and did some intern for an accounting firm. And after a summer of interning for an accounting firm, realized I didn't want to spend the next 30 years doing accounting work after about a week of it. So with a finance background and nothing else, didn't know what to do. So ended up getting into some B2B sales fresh out of college. In early 2000, started to look at working in medical device or pharmaceutical sales because, pharmaceuticals were all the rage in the early 2000s. And couldn't seem to land a job. I would get to the 9th interview and they'd always pass me over for somebody else. So at the same time, while I was interviewing for pharma jobs, there was a dental medical sales opportunity. Never thought of dental, right? Just unless you're, involved in the industry or have, maybe a parent that was a dentist, you go to the dentist, but it's not something that you really think about. Especially dental sales, you may think about being a dentist. So talk to a company called Coltine Whale Dent, Swiss, a merger of a Swiss and an American company, and ended up becoming a Philadelphia sales rep for Coltine, Philly, New York, Delaware. And so that's kind of how I got into the industry, was as a salesperson. And we had some great clinical training, spent 5 weeks learning and dental anatomy, and we just needed to know a little bit more about our products than the dentist did. So we focused on those 200-300 products that we had at the time, quite a few, and really it got into it. I mean, it was just quite a bit of fun to interact with dentists, being able to have conversations with them, intelligent conversations, and influence buying habits to really provide value. And then, kind of come back and find out how things are working out. And so really enjoyed that and did that for 7 years, moved up the food chain, so to speak, at Coltine, was a national sales trainer there, and then a regional manager. And then around 2008, started a platform called Dental Sales Pro, which was a networking website. This was before Facebook was anything beyond, being a college kid platform. But connected a lot of dental manufacturers and distributors and got some wind behind it and had a medical publisher acquire that. So that's kind of how I got into publishing. So through publishing, then saw the consolidation in the industry, and around 2012, our advertisers going, hey, there are these crazy things called dental group practices, and we don't know how to sell to them. So can you help us start a magazine for group practices? So helped a publisher start a magazine called Efficiency in Group Practice for DSOs. Weren't DSOs at the time, just group practices. And then with the co-founder here, Kim Larson, started Group Dentistry Now, which is where I am now, the CEO, in 2014.
So tell us a little bit about Group Dentistry Now and what you guys are currently doing.
Yeah, so we create content specific, as you can, just like the name says, in group practices and DSOs. So I think right now we have about 1,200 articles. It's a website. We don't do any print, so everything's online. There's no paywall, so you can search and find anything we've ever published there. But we kind of run the gamut of things that anybody would be interested in, whether you work for a large DSO, like a Dental Care Alliance, for example, or clinician there, or if you could be a CEO or somebody on the executive side of things, could be an assistant. So just a lot of relevant content. So anything from all the deals that were done in a given month. Heartland bought X amount of practices. Private equity bought this platform, et cetera. We do articles, it's kind of tips and tricks if you're a smaller group or you're a dentist that's looking to maybe go from one location to two. We interview people that are in that position. So hey, I now have 5 practices. This is the path that I took. So a lot of learning, so education, some clinical, but light on the clinical because there's so many other clinical publications out there. So think of it as you see the business of dentistry, but really the business of multi-site dentistry.
So what is your, because obviously we're in the, I think everybody can recognize that we're in a large state of flux in dentistry where, like you said, there's a lot of consolidation. And I think that's going to be going on for a while. And there's also a lot of solo practitioners that are looking to become multi-site. If you were a dentist listening to this podcast, like many are, and you have a single location, you're thinking of doing multi-site, or you have a couple locations, maybe looking to do 10, or you have 10 and you're looking to join a larger group. What do you think the current state of the industry is? And where would you position yourself to be sort of like, if all other factors being equal, right? Because not, there's other factors
Sure.
to be on a personal level, but just on a sort of a timeline of the food chain, so to speak, what do you think is the sweet spot right now if you're a dentist?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think dentistry has never seen such opportunity. So I think sometimes, especially if you're a solo practitioner and you see the consolidation, there may be some fear, right? Going, oh my gosh, the competition, they do cheap, less expensive dentistry. They can negotiate better deals with insurance companies, better at marketing, whatever. Which some of that's true. So I think number one, you can learn from a lot of these groups. I mean, we have a lot of education that's free. So whether you come to our website and you subscribe to the newsletter and you can learn, or you just pay close attention to what these DSOs are doing. Yeah, it's probably going to be hard to replicate a DCA or Heartland or an Aspen if you have 1, 2, 7 practices. Probably not what you want to do anyway. I mean, I think that the sweet spot or the opportunity is if you've got 1 or 2 locations, what you don't want to do, I see this a lot. We have we have a consulting arm, so we work with groups. I'm on the board of a couple of DSOs. One that's North American based, so based in Canada, but has practices here in the U.S. Well, what you see with a lot of the groups that we speak to from an affiliation acquisition standpoint is they get to a certain point. So, what practice count wise, and it varies. So it could be 3 locations. It could be going from 1 to 2. And then all of a sudden, what happens is you almost start to go backwards. So that 1 practice or the 2 practices, you're just kicking butt. I mean, things are just going well. And all of a sudden, you maybe get out a little bit ahead of your skis and you start to go back. So you're doing more work. Your revenue may be going up, but your expenses may be going way, way up. So that seems to be a trap that I think everybody at some point falls into. And maybe it's not just dentistry. It's as any business scales up, right? So I think it's paying close attention to what others are doing, learning, educating yourself, and just making sure that you're not growing faster than you're capable of. Bringing in talent, and a lot of times, you're the clinician. Maybe you need some business talent, and I see it a lot with some, especially the emerging groups out there that you've got so people that grow up and together go to maybe college roommates. One goes off to dental school, the other goes off and gets their MBA. And I'll bet you there are a dozen DSOs right now, emerging groups, where they've come back together because the dentist goes, hey, there's this thing going on in the industry that you may be really interested in, and I could use your help. So they kind of come together and they form an emerging group. So there's a real opportunity to, I think, provide really quality patient care, build a serious business. And that serious business could be 2 kick-ass practices. And that's all you need. It could be 5, 7, 10 with the right people surrounding you. But the opportunity, I think, is to scale smartly, if that makes sense. And there are resources that weren't out there 5 years ago. There are so many different meetings, or always were practice management consultants, but now there are multi-site practice management consultants that can come in and that can help you scale up and to add the right people. And at what inflection point do I add a COO and bring in an HR person and a marketing person and people that have made those mistakes so you don't have to make them again. So I think that's where the real opportunity is. There are plenty of blueprints out there that weren't out there 5, 6 years ago.
I always say that about this moment in time, that it's the best time to be a dentist and it's the worst time to be a dentist. I think you're 100% right. wherever you are, from a single location to running 100 locations, they both have their strengths. And the key, I think, is knowing the strengths and leaning into those. And the reason why it's the worst time to be a dentist is I think it's the worst time to be a dentist if you don't actually pay attention to the business, if you don't make the small adjustments required. If you have a single location and you just want to stay a single location and you differentiate yourself and you lean into doing the things that is more difficult across 100 practices, I think, and frankly, our competition isn't each other anyway. So it really does come down to just if you focus on making the small changes that is required to meet the growing demands of our patient base, I think everybody will do well. But if you don't, I think there's going to be practices that are withering more than ever before. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the opportunity is greater than it's ever been. But to your point, if you're not changing, if you're not growing, you're dying, right? And we hear that across all businesses. So I think it's important to understand that you need to really keep up with what's going on. Again, you don't have to be a DSO. You might not even like DSOs. There are plenty of them that I don't like, and there are plenty of them that I do. But I think the point is you can learn a lot from what's already been accomplished by some large groups, some of the smaller groups maybe that are in your market, and you take that what fits for your particular practice, for your patient base. We talked a little bit about before we recorded this, Brian. You talked about the retailization or the consumerization of everything, and I think that's something to kind of keep in mind. Are you still treating your patients like patients, or are you also treating them as a customer? So providing the best patient care, you think sometimes that's enough. And I think it's providing the best patient care with the best patient experience, which are two different things, right? It's being open during the times that they want to be open. It's providing the services that they want, right? As much in-house as you can, or being able to refer. You know, patient communication, communicating to them the way they want to be communicated to now, whether it's via text or via email. So I think little things like that are things that dentists really need to pay attention to.
That's the entire topic of my book, my friend, which is about those little things that basically I think we live in a world that half the adults don't see a dentist regularly. And a lot of that comes down to us not being convenient for patients to come in and not addressing that patient experience piece. So if we as dentists view ourselves as part of our role, maybe a major part of our role is to increase the oral health of the population, we need to address the fact that half the people don't see us. And that comes down to convenience. I personally also agree, or I think that the influence of corporate dentistry, meaning the largest groups, like even DCA, which I'm part of, and I think all groups are different. Every group of dental practices is a totally different. They operate completely differently. But I think that the influence of corporate dentistry is overstated. It's still a small percentage of dental practices. Maybe it's going to change, but I do you agree with that the influence of like the large groups, maybe on a for certain sectors like vendors, it has huge influence, but for the average dentist, I don't think the influence of a corporate practice really does that really enter into the sort of the success of a smaller group.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, number one, I think it's probably a bigger piece of the market than a lot of people realize, and it depends on who you talk to, whether it's ADA numbers or whether you talk to the ADSO. The numbers kind of vary depending on, well, what's a DSO, right? Which is
Mhm.
it depends. But to your point, there are the large groups because the models are so vastly different. Yeah, they may if they come into your market again. I think there's a lot you can learn from them. Will they be disruptive? Maybe temporarily. I think you could probably adjust. You're a lot more nimble. Some of these groups are so large that, like any large company, to make big changes is really difficult. So that's one thing that I think a solo practitioner would have, solo owner. I think though the other thing, you look at all these emerging groups out there, which are the majority of DSOs. So when I say there's a lot of the market is multi-site, a lot of them are doctor owned and led small groups. So do they have a lot of influence? That's kind of where I would look and I'd say, hey, what are these emerging groups doing that maybe we can mimic? Not saying you have to be an emerging group. You could do that with one location. So yeah, I think your point is really well taken. The large groups, while they have some influence, I think the day to day, I think it's more important to kind of figure out, well, what are maybe the docs in my area doing, in my region, at my study club, local study club doing, like, hey, I heard, Dr. Clark just added maybe 2 or 3 practices. Maybe I should kind of find out what's going on over there. Does that make sense? Or does it just make sense to expand what we're doing here in our one location?
Yeah, I think you answered the question that I meant to ask, so I appreciate that. Because
Roundabout.
I think of corporate dentistry as more than 100 practices, right?
Yeah.
And I think that, to your point, like, that's obviously there's a few of those or several of those, but where the real growth is happening is in the smaller groups, 20 practices, 5 practices, and that's where I think a lot of the audience that we're reaching today, I think, could look to you to either, for inspiration or ideas. So thanks for answering the question that I meant to ask.
Yeah, I'll just build on that point real quick. Some numbers that I have that I think are pretty accurate. I mean, they're always in flux, but the LDSOs, which are what we would consider the local DSOs, the small, like 5 to 19 locations, they're about 1,000 platforms in the US, so 1,000 of those emerging groups. And then when you get to about 20 to 99 locations, which would be considered a regional DSO or an RDSO, somewhere around 100 of those platforms. And then to your point about, the corporate, the large, over 100 practices, the national DSOs, NDSOs, right around 20, I think, which is the exact number you hit on there. So about 20 platforms that have 100 plus. So there's plenty more of the smaller groups out there that I think, you can definitely look to and say, hey, those are some practices that we can probably adopt pretty easily, versus looking at what a Heartland or an Aspen does, and really saying, how is it really relevant to what you're doing day to day as a clinician?
So do you have a lot of information for maybe single location but multiple dentists under one roof?
Yeah, that's another interesting thing. When we kind of slice up, we talk about number of practices, but not a group practice, which a lot of people think of, and which is also a group practice. One location maybe has 20 operatories and 3 or 4 clinicians working there. Yeah, we do a lot of work with, I would say, 2, 3 location groups, and a lot of work with single locations that are just massive, that are just doing it right, don't need to expand because they've got the footprint and the space to do it, and a great location. So
Yeah,
we
I
have
think
information
that's
and education as well for somebody that just has that kind of group practice.
yeah, I think, and your website is has a host of great information for everybody in the dental profession. So where can people go to find out more information?
Sure, it's groupdentistrynow.com. So groupdentistrynow.com, and you can go and there's a search bar, so you can search for whatever it is you're looking for, whether it's the procurement surveys we do or the DSO deal roundup, where you can see the activity that's going on. We do a weekly newsletter. There's no charge for it. We don't spam at all. So we send out one newsletter a week, and it's chock full of editorial content. We do podcasts as well. So I think we have about 75 podcasts and webinars, but just go to groupdentistrynow.com, sign up for the newsletter, and you'll get all the information in your inbox on Thursday.
Well, thanks, Bill, for being on the podcast and for all you're doing to distribute information about a very important aspect of the industry.
Well, thanks, Bryan. I appreciate it. And thanks, everybody, for watching and listening.